One. So, hello and welcome again. Thank you for joining us today. For some of you, I know it's late afternoon. For others, it might be early morning or early afternoon. My name is Amy Consalvi, and I am the Director of Education and Visitor Services at the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton, Massachusetts. Today's program is in partnership with the Wende Museum located in Culver City. The Wende is a cultural laboratory that pairs unparalleled collections from the Cold War era with contemporary artists, filmmakers, musicians, scholars, and others to create something new and transformative. The subject of today's talk, the exhibition Playground of the Autocrats, is currently on view at the Museum of Russian Icons through January 21st, 2021, and it features the art of Anne Bobroff-Hajal. The exhibition features a series of polyptychs comprised of multi-layered panels that reflect the artist's simultaneous interest in contemporary animation and history. Anne earned a PhD in Russian history, for which she conducted extensive research in the Soviet Union. Leading today's interview is Yu Siegel, Chief Curator and Director of Programming at the Wende Museum. He published widely on art and politics, German history, and Cold War cultural history. He has organized 23 exhibitions at the Wende, as well as numerous programs, such as the ongoing weekly interview series, Cold War Spaces, which I highly recommend that everyone check out. So with that, I will turn it over to Anne, and we will hear her presentation.
Okay, so now share screen and slideshow. Okay. So is that, you got it, right? That's right. Okay, so as a quick introductory overview of my art, this is my largest completed polyptych. A polyptych is a multi-paneled artwork made up of any number of pieces. This one is entitled Darling Godsonny, Ivan the Terrible advises the infant Stalin. This is how I imagine Tsar's Ivan advising the infant Stalin. We'll get back to them in a minute when we zoom in on details of some of the polyptychs I've created. Studying history and making art never felt to me like they should be separate, because I experience Russian history, including the really serious academic analysis, as the most dramatic, thrilling subject for my art. My goal with my art is to beguile viewers of every kind and age. From the moment I start planning my comical but deadly serious art, I make choices that I hope will elicit this kind of response. I love when people really engage with my art, study it. Here's someone touching the painting, crouch down to look at it, take series of pictures with their phones, and talk to each other about it. You may wonder while I'm speaking whether the goal of my art is simply to educate people about Russian history. I would say my goal, and please keep focusing on this woman in the middle here in brown with her children as I zoom out of on this painting. My goal is to paint the web of connection between individual human lives. Here you see that woman, she's still here. And now you see she's threatened by this invader, and the larger society, the autocratic government, and the geography on which they live. So now you're seeing both this woman still in the middle here, but you're also seeing the flat Russian steppes. I paint every single person in my crowd scenes as an individual portrait with tiny brushes and magnifying glass. So when I show you crowd scenes, I hope that you'll zero in on individual people who appeal to you, to imagine their lives interweaving into the whole fabric of society. As a historian, I do have a very specific, somewhat unusual academic perspective that I make a visual argument for in my art for academic audiences about the importance of physical and human geography in shaping societies across the globe. Here's the globe down here. But as an artist, I want to paint the entire society and also individual people struggling to achieve their life goals within it, the full tapestry of human aspirations, raw ambition, pain, and joy. Today, I'll raise a serious topic that relates to the Cold War as I show some details from my large polyptych. So here's our serious topic. During the Cold War, dominant culture in the United States vilified the Soviet Union by claiming that all communism is dictatorship. That is, a police state with no freedom of speech, press, or assembly, no opposition political parties, a centralized economy. In reality, though, most of those negative characterizations were actually as much features of Tsarist autocracy as they were of the Soviet system. Tsarism, like Stalinism, had a highly centralized ruling elite, as you can begin to see in one of my paintings of Tsar Ivan with his nobility below him. During Tsarism, anyone who wanted to loosen the dictatorship just a little was by definition a revolutionary, subject to arrest and exile to Siberia or worse. This painting and the next are of Tsar Ivan's time, the 16th century, but the same institutions existed into the 19th and early 20th centuries under Tsarism. The Tsarist autocracy, just like the Soviet Union, had a secret police. Here we have the Oprichnina during Ivan's time period, doing their evil deeds. So the Tsarist autocracy had a secret police, no freedom of speech, press, or assembly, and no opposition political parties. Again, this painting is of Ivan's time, but there was a Tsarist secret police active right up to the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. The first Russian revolutionaries had wanted to create a just, fair society for all its laborers. But realizing the kind of communism most early Bolsheviks dreamed of wasn't possible under conditions at that time in Russia, a poor country where 80% of the population were illiterate peasants. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union had reverted to being essentially a new iteration of Tsarist autocracy, intensified to transform Russia rapidly into an industrialized power. Russia couldn't protect itself from powerful industrialized neighbors without industrializing itself. The persistence of Tsarist features through Stalinist communism onward has implications for how we think about the Cold War. I suspect that both capitalist and communist elites, each for their own reasons, falsely identified all visions of communism as involving repressive autocratic police states and deleted from public discourse the more egalitarian 19th and early 20th century visions of communism or socialism as bringing justice, well-being, dignity, and democratic control over people's lives, as the early Russian revolutionaries and others elsewhere had envisioned. My art attempts to break the Cold War universal equation of all concepts of communism with a dictatorial police state by probing conditions in 1917 Russia that caused the persistence of Tsarist autocratic institutions despite a revolution that began with very different ideals. We don't have time today to go into the complex reasons why this happened. For now, I'm simply going to show you some examples of how, as an artist, I visualize the reemergence of intensified Tsarist-like institutions under the disguise of so-called communism or socialism. So these two images compare serfdom on this side these two images compare serfdom, which existed for centuries under the Tsar, with collective farms as they developed under Stalin by the 1930s. I created these two paintings to collage into my 7-foot wide polyptych, dress it up in resplendent clothes. And you can also see them maybe more clearly here. There's serfdom and here's collectivization. This is Catherine's polyptych, Catherine the Great, who here in her polyptych is also advising the infant Stalin. You see him here and her here. So this is how I visualized serfdom's return under Stalin by a new name, collectivization, that's just stenciled over the name, the label serfdom from the earlier painting. And I painted a banner here reading Stalin's Red Dawn Collective Farm on the front portico of the same manor house as in the Tsarist serfdom painting on the left. I'll zoom in on a couple of details of these two paintings. Many peasants themselves felt collectivization was a second serfdom, now with the state appropriating most of what they grew. Soviet collective farms were not collectively run. They were run by often corrupt petty bureaucrats here, who in my collectivization painting on the right simply replaced the serf owner's family in serfdom on the left. Serfs were tied to their lord's estate. They weren't free to go elsewhere to work if they wanted to. So for serfdom, I painted every serf chained to the lord's estate. There's a chain coming off every one of these people. Beginning under Stalin, the Soviet system of internal passports also tied peasants to the land of their collective farms. So again, they weren't free to leave when they wanted to either. In my painting, collective farmers are also chained, but this time to a new name. Note also the addition of the tractors in this painting back here. This was part of the highly pressured rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union that I referred to a minute ago. There are always historical changes atop the continuities. So this is a last look at how I portrayed the rebirth of one Tsarist-like institution, in this case, serfdom. Now I'll move to another polyptych about another kind of continuity. This is Darling Godsonny again. This is a photo as it's exhibited right now at the Museum of Russian Icons in Massachusetts. And if you're in the area, please go to the museum and see the original paintings with the appropriate COVID measures. This polyptych is Tsar Ivan's advice to the infant Stalin about how to destroy his rivals and create a new elite loyal only to him. By the late 1930s, Stalin was firmly in power, and many of the dedicated early revolutionaries who had dreamed of a truly just society had been executed or died in labor camps during Stalin's purges. How did Stalin manage to destroy all his Bolshevik rivals? Stalin built his power by means startlingly similar to the way Tsar Ivan solidified his autocratic power in the 16th century. Hence, my whimsical satire of Ivan as the infant Stalin's flying godfather, advising Stalin to follow in his footsteps. So I explored this parallel in Darling Godsonny. We'll look at some of its details as a visitor, let's say you, to the Museum of Russian Icons, can read its panels from left to right as you would read a book. There's a story that plays out here across centuries. Today, we'll only have time to look at the first two panels, these two here, but you can see more on the Museum of Russian Icons website in their video of me giving an overview of this entire piece. So in the first onion dome above panel 1, you see my flying godfather Tsar Ivan introducing the beginning of the narration. Here are panels 1 and 2. The hierarchy of Ivan the Terrible's time in panel 1 looks a lot like what emerged after the Bolshevik Revolution in panel 2. In each, you see a triangular-shaped hierarchy that has a wider base for support and narrows upward toward the autocratic ruler. Peasants appear across the bottom of every panel. They are almost, though not completely, unchanged over the centuries between Ivan and Stalin. So let's look more closely at panel 1. I hope you can all see the blue, red, yellow, and green clans. These are vertical clans, as you can see, forming the overall triangular shape with the Tsar at the top. I painted the clans vertically because the Russian nobility built their power through family-based patronage clans, where the most powerful relatives close to the Tsar, up here, passed patronage goodies downward to their lower kin, in return for the lower kins helping them rise up to the top and stay on top. So this is an example from my blue clan. And you can see how I painted the lower clan members kneeling to form a solid base, and from there helping more powerful nobles to scramble further upward. That solid foundation is all important to support the clan tower above it. And you see it in every one of the clans during Ivan's time. Clan members at all levels battled other clans for power. As an expression of the intensity of these rivalries, I painted clans physically fighting each other. You can see all this kicking going on, punching and kicking contenders from other clans out of the way. A few fall off the pyramid because the fighting gets so vicious, these and these. In fact, each real noble clan in history endlessly fought other clans for resources, favor, status, and influence, with perpetual scheming, constant lawsuits, and sometimes actual brawling, seeking more favors for their own clan. Here's more fighting from lower down the hierarchy, the clan hierarchy. You see this blue clan guy kicking this one, these red and yellow clan people fighting and tackling each other. These clan battles went on all the way up to the most powerful, richest boyars in the Kremlin. This is the Kremlin here, who I painted yanking on the bottom of Ivan's robe to win more patronage for their own clan as they fight to limit other clans' share. So you see these people tackling each other. This guy is punching this guy. We have a brawl going on back here and some more tackling here between clans. So let's move now to panel 2, which moves into the 1920s with Stalin, who isn't yet firmly in power. We always think of the Russian Revolution as a huge break with the past, but startlingly, after the Russian Revolution, patronage clans formed all over again. Here I want to thank UCLA historian Arch Getty for his extraordinary book on Bolshevik clans and for answering all my many questions during my research and painting. Any errors, of course, are my own. So again, I painted the clans blue, red, yellow, and green, almost identical to Ivan's, but with some important historical changes. First, the new Bolshevik clans were not family-based, as the Tsarist ones had been, so I couldn't paint many women in this panel. Instead, you'll notice some military coats and hats here. This guy, this one here, this one, and others too. Yes, so these are military coats because rather than being family-based, the Bolshevik clans grew out of secret underground Bolshevik agitator cells during Tsarism and in army units during the Civil War that raged across the country for 3 brutal years after the revolution. So this is a comparison of Ivan's blue clan detail that we looked at a minute ago with the equivalent blue Bolshevik clan. The clothing is different, but still the less powerful members help their more powerful patrons rise up in return for goodies that will filter back down. Another important historical difference was a few individual peasants rising across this barrier down here into the Bolshevik clans. You see one, the blue clan here, he's hitching his way over that bar. He was rising as an individual, though, not as a member of a united peasant class pursuing their own collective interests. So let's look at Stalin at this time, the 1920s, at the top of the Bolshevik clans. After the death of Lenin, Stalin wasn't at all secure at the top of the new Soviet hierarchy. You see here how tippy he is. Other early Bolshevik leaders were still vying for power, especially the brilliant, far more principled Trotsky. Many expected Trotsky to be Lenin's successor as the top Soviet leader, not Stalin. So I painted him emerging a little bit in front of Stalin. But look at other Bolshevik contenders' clans, which I painted in lavender and orange, both of which have leaders at the top. One of these is Trotsky's, the Lavender Clan, but don't reach all the way down to a bedrock of low-level supporters. Many Bolshevik clans have the same bottom support that Ivan's clans had, but not the orange or lavender clans. So let's focus now particularly on Trotsky's clan, which peters out way up here. Like Stalin, I painted Trotsky with top Bolsheviks grabbing onto his clothes. You can see them, and this is a repeat, obviously, of the boyars grabbing onto Tsar Ivan's clothing. So they are also, in the Bolshevik period, these guys are grabbing onto Trotsky's clothing, competing for patronage and favors, as we always see with patronage clans. But without a foundation of supporters all the way down, a clan can't survive. I'll just point out here, there are all these more people who are clinging on to Stalin's clothes. Why did Trotsky's clan not have bedrock support? Why was Stalin's foundation so much stronger? In the decades before the 1917 revolution, many top Bolsheviks, such as Lenin, this is Lenin's mugshot after being arrested by the Tsarist police, and Trotsky, this is his mugshot, also after being arrested by the Tsarist police. Many of these leaders got fed up with getting arrested by the Tsarist secret police and getting exiled to Siberia. So after one or two arrests, many Bolshevik leaders fled to Europe where they could live and work more freely. So this is the 25-year-old Lenin. He's in the middle. In the center of his political group just before his arrest and escape to Europe. Many of those who went to Europe, including Trotsky, were brilliant intellectuals. In Europe, they researched economics and history and wrote books and political tracts about how to create new, freer, and more just societies. They became famous within the European left. They held sophisticated intellectual political debates and conferences and planned political actions. Lenin was highly respected among underground activists back in Russia, and his political writings were smuggled home and avidly read in secret. Many Bolshevik leaders stayed in Europe for decades and returned to Russia only after the 1917 fall of the Tsar. Stalin, in contrast, lived in Russia all during these decades, braving repeated arrests, Siberian exiles, and escapes through the icy vastness of Siberia. So this is Stalin's mugshot from one of his arrests. So Stalin became Lenin's point person in the home country who could receive and secretly disseminate smuggled political literature to underground activists. To the extent possible, Stalin kept underground cells secretly coordinated with the plans made by those leaders in Europe. For Lenin, Stalin was the only person in Russia who could get things done, despite the Tsar's secret police. Stalin even organized bank robberies to finance political work. In other words, for decades before 1917, Stalin was having the kind of constant, long-term personal contact with underground political activists that was already accumulating the deep personal and political bonds that would start to form his patronage clan long before 1917. After the revolution, many laborers respected and identified more with Stalin than with the intellectuals who had lived safely in the faraway, unfamiliar West for so long. During the decades that Bolshevik leaders lived in Europe, they weren't having daily life personal contact with Russians, risking their lives and well-being. And it's constant, everyday contact when your very life depends on a trusted group that created undying loyalty in patron-client relationships. Last, when the Bolshevik leaders returned from Europe and came to power in Russia, they viewed Stalin as a ruthless, crude, uncultured, less sophisticated thinker than they were. He was given what was seen as the unglamorous scut-work job of heading the secretariat, responsible for implementing the leader's decisions. This was basically the same thing Stalin had been doing for years in Russia for Lenin. The big difference now was that the Bolsheviks were in power and had seized the assets of the Tsarist government. So Stalin's job included both hiring people to do the work and handing out access to perks such as higher food rations at a time when many people were starving. Stalin had known lower-level activists in Russia for years, so he knew who could successfully accomplish which job. So panel 2 explores the idea that Stalin's ability to begin to amass power after the revolution, winning out over more brilliant and principled leaders, was due to the latter unwillingly ceding to Stalin the highest levels of the patronage pyramid, including jobs, which we're seeing all over the place here, and access to food and housing. All of this put Stalin in exactly the same position at the top of the patronage heap that the Tsar had occupied before the revolution. The first patronage Stalin had to hand out, in fact, came from Tsarist wealth, which the Bolsheviks, of course, seized when they took power. And Stalin continued having control over Soviet wealth until his death in 1953. This is my panel 5 painting of Stalin at the height of his power, controlling the wealth created over decades by the labor of Soviet people. So in conclusion, what does this mean for our understanding of the Cold War? Actually, that shouldn't come quite yet. Communism and socialism are both terms that have had many different, often diametrically opposed meanings to different people over the last 2 centuries. What the West demonized during the Cold War was actually a new iteration of Tsarism, disguised under the ideology of a society organized around the needs of its people. I would love to see us return to the original vision of the terms socialism and communism, not as autocratic police states, but as governments whose priority are justice, well-being, and dignity for all, and full democratic control over all aspects of people's lives. So that's it. And I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Anne, for the presentation. So now we'll move into the interview portion. So I will turn it over to Yus.
Thank you very much. And what a fascinating presentation. There's so much to discover in your work. And I'm sure you can spend hours and hours standing before your triptychs or polyptychs. To start with a more personal question, can you tell us a little bit about your personal background and why you are so interested in Russian and Soviet history?
Well, I was in college and graduate school in the days of the anti-Vietnam War and other social movements, when a lot of my peers were extremely interested in the Russian Revolution. But that just solidified an interest that had gone back to my childhood because I had a Russian immigrant grandfather who died before I was born. And for whatever reason, I identified profoundly with him, even though I never met him. He was an inventor of interesting things like the directional turn signals on cars in the 1920s, and some other things, and he manufactured them in Wisconsin. He had come into the United States in around 1905. But another intriguing thing about him is that he had traveled back to the Soviet Union, or to what was Bolshevik Russia then, after the revolution. And it was illegal at that time for an American to do that. And we never knew exactly what the heck he was doing there, except it had something to do with selling boots to the government. So then I was able to do some research after the internet blossomed and search engines. And I discovered some amazing things about my grandfather that just sort of intensified this and actually impacted the way I was painting things in a certain way. He was picked up on this return from this trip to Bolshevik Russia around 1919. And he was picked up by the Bureau of Investigation on the steamship that he returned on. And he was carrying a long sort of coded letter about various things, including a shipment of British coal that the Bolsheviks wanted to pay with using Tsarist gold, as it became called. And so my grandfather, I don't know, managed to get out of trouble, and he eventually testified before Congress, asking the United States to allow Bolsheviks to use Tsarist gold to pay for goods American businessmen wanted to sell them. And I that was part of why I got so into doing that whole Tsarist gold painting, and how I was able to understand more where the original wealth was coming from, because of this big testimony of my grandfather about Tsarist gold. So,
right, so it started with something more specific, and then it's evolved into this
yeah,
very wide interest in
absolutely, yes.
history. That's so nice. Also, I was struck by the formal qualities of your work, and then specifically the polyptych organization, but also the onion-shaped tops of your paintings. Can you tell us where that comes from, what sources you used, and what they mean to you?
Well, the actual onion-shaped domes, not all of them are onion-shaped.
Right.
Different ones have different shaped tops. The one that you're mainly referring to with the sort of overlapping onion domes are visually like the Kremlin domes. I spent a year in the Soviet Union doing research for my dissertation, and I obviously visually, it was an incredible experience. And just sitting in the library looking out at all the Kremlin domes was wonderful. So that's sort of where that comes from. But my main interest in icons is their similarity to animation storyboards and graphic novels and comic books, because what I'm really interested in is telling stories in images and text. I turn to them sometimes, to icons, for how those painters arranged images within a flat surface, because it always comes up as an issue for an artist. And I realized recently, actually, and maybe you're asking me that, brought this into my mind. I think that I often use the dome space for the sort of commentary that's going on by the animated characters. And then the serious stuff is happening underneath that in the big panels. So
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So it's very clear from your presentation that your artwork is heavily based on historical research. And I was wondering, what is your approach to research? Do you consider yourself an academic scholar who then translates her findings in art, or do you have a slightly different and maybe more creative approach to history?
well, I think there are similarities and differences. In the sort of obsessional thoroughness of what I do, it's very typical of an academic historian. I think the biggest difference, I mean, I read tons of stuff. I do huge amounts of research before I ever begin painting one of these things, and actually during the process too. But the big difference is that an academic historian typically focuses on primary sources like newspapers of the time period, or original documents or whatever. And I can't do that. So I read a million books read by academic historians, and I email millions of them. I get in touch with them, and that's how Arch and I got to know each other.
Right,
So,
because it's also interesting that different historians often have a different approach to history. For instance, some Soviet historians very much focus on Stalin and other individuals, whereas Arch Getty, for instance, has a very open eye for social structures.
yeah.
And how did you make your choice in perspective in that sense?
I don't think this was a choice. I was very dissatisfied the whole time I was in graduate school because of this emphasis about just, the debates, the sort of intellectual debates among people at the top. And I think that I totally resonated with what Arch was doing, because, and there are other historians too, like Sheila Fitzpatrick is famous for this, that they were looking more at social history, what's going on beneath these kind of leadership things. And so yeah, that was I totally resonated with Arch, and his work came along for me at a very important time, because I just had this feeling that there were Bolshevik clans. And I really spent about 6 months doing research, and I could see little glimpses. Typically, nobody gets down to the real roots the way Arch does. And I was really getting kind of desperate after this 6 months of research, that I was never going to be able to, to paint these second panels. And I will also talk about one other book just briefly. I'll name it, Gerald Easter's Reconstructing the State, which is also a wonderful, sort of the first book I found that gave me any information. But Arch really got into the weeds with these things.
I see, right.
So I then, after I connected with him, I was able to really paint that.
Wonderful, yeah. So you were evidently not the first one who sees parallels between Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, and Stalin. Even Stalin himself identified himself with Ivan and commissioned film director Sergei Eisenstein in 1941 to make a 3-part movie about him. So what were your sources of inspiration to put these two figures aligned?
Well, let's see. I was looking for ways of talking about continuity, visual ways of talking about continuity. And this was one of them. You know, these big polyptychs began originally as scripts for animated films. That was my initial idea of this. And I was going to have these czars sort of stealing the infant Stalin from his mother and taking him out for a picnic in the Caucasus or something. And so it sort of started with these people. And I think I chose those czars, those figures, because they're they're well known to an American audience. But also there was this huge connectedness that I think a lot of people have probably noticed between between Stalin and Ivan, and maybe also some other czars as well. I think that you can all, I mean, that's sort of what all of these polyptychs of mine are doing, is
Right.
showing how these so-called communist czars were actually looking to the autocratic past of their country, and shockingly enough, we're using them as models.
Right, right. So there is one more question I want to ask you before we move to the Q&A. I want to ask the viewers to put any questions you have in the Q&A box, because that is where I'm going to look, not in the chat box. So my final question for you for now is, in your work, you very clearly connect Russian history with Soviet history.
Mm-hmm.
Do you also see parallels with the present? For instance, the current Putin administration, or even maybe abstracted from Russia, what is going on in the United States with the elections right now? Are there any points of reference, any topical relevance you see in your work in that respect?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, clans reemerged after the end of communism in the early 90s. And they've been very, very important in the development of Russian society since then. And you know, that period is not my expertise. And so I didn't paint it into that polyptych, although the last dome in that big long polyptych does have photographs of Putin and his clan members looking slyly back at this history. But in the United States, I think the continuities that, or the linkage that I find really important is that I do believe that there are these huge continuities in every country on the face of the earth. And that, for example, in the United States, in theory, we abolished slavery. In practice, it was followed by sharecropping, which was almost the same thing as slavery, but with a slightly different setup. We had Jim Crow, lynchings, real estate redlining, mass incarcerations, and these are all sort of in the same way that Stalin reiterated the Tsarist structures. I think we reiterate the same things here. So.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. There are already lots of questions in the Q&A, so let's move on quickly. First is by Christine Edwards. It looks like, she writes, it looks like the last panel has Vladimir Putin on top. Well, you just spoke about it. Can you speak a bit about the similarities between Putin, Stalin, and Ivan the Terrible? Well, actually, you just commented on that.
Right.
I don't know if you want to add anything there. But
I think we probably covered it. Yeah.
I think so too. So then we have Joanna Weinstock. Were you already an artist when you studied Russian history?
Yes, I was always an artist. I was growing, when I was growing up, I was painting from very young, and it's always felt totally natural to me. I had a wonderful history professor as an undergraduate at Sarah Lawrence, Gerda Lerner, who told me that I was really good in history, which really surprised me. And she thought I should go to graduate school. So I thought, whoa, nobody ever told me I could do anything besides being an artist. And so I thought, oh, I'll give that a whirl. And so I did that, and I love historical research, but I was clearly not in, I didn't feel at home in academia. And so it was always this sort of problem for me. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Susan Arterium asks, and do you see universality in power structures beyond Russia? Do autocratic governments share these structures, and do they arise in the same way?
Well, you know what's really, these are huge questions that I'm not sure I can answer. And I do think that we have to look at particularities in different areas of the world that are different and cause different, we had slavery in the United States, Russia had serfdom, there were some differences, but there are also similarities. Something that's very interesting lately that I cannot get over is how Trump has disappeared into the White House and is not, he's not putting himself out publicly speaking. This is exactly what Stalin did when he discovered that the Nazis had just invaded Russia, when he thought he had taken care of that and prevented that with the Hitler-Stalin pact. And he hid in the Kremlin for 10 days while the Nazis were zooming across the flat land of the Soviet Union and just destroying all of its military that was mostly in that area. So there are these extraordinary similarities that are bizarre.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Kate Grant asks, you mentioned historians who inspired your work. Are there artists who inspired you? Are there other artists or historians like yourself who do work in graphic novel or animated formats that you enjoy?
Well, I love art animation, it's an art form that's not seen very much. So many people aren't even aware of it. But I was, I would say that there are certain animation artists whose work I love. They're typically doing what I'm interested in doing, which is telling a story through pictures. And one in particular that I will recommend everybody try to see if they can is Richard Williams, who was the animator who created little animated segments in the feature film Charge of the Light Brigade about the Crimean War. And there are brilliant political animated segments in that movie created by Richard Williams. And, I admire him above everybody else, but there are many other art animators or animation artists who do fabulous work.
Right. I have two short questions by Joanna Weinstock here. She asks, do you paint in other styles besides iconic? And also, was art part of your PhD thesis?
It was not part of my PhD thesis at all. I really thought I was leaving that part of myself behind. I wanted to try something new. And then, of course, I couldn't let go of it. But anyway, what was the other piece of the question?
Do you paint in other styles besides iconic?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a portrait painting business. And so I've done a lot of sort of very realistic portraits, but my heart is really in what I'm doing now. And I wouldn't say that that necessarily I'll always do icon shapes. Actually, the new polyptych that I'm working on, which is Peter the Great's polyptych, as he advises the infant Stalin, has gold spires alternating with their replicas, sort of little mini replicas of the spire on top of the St. Petersburg Admiralty that was created by Peter the Great. So those are not exactly icon they're not icon shapes, but so I'm not wedded to icon shapes, and I will do things. Undoubtedly, I started working on something actually about American slavery. So, and now, you know, it's harder to come up with a shape that's interesting for about the United States.
Right. Kent Russell asks, will you comment on how physical geography may have shaped the Russian character? That's another huge one.
It's a huge one, but I think it's very extremely relevant. I'll mention also Alex Halberstad, who has written this terrific, very interesting book. I was just speaking with him briefly yesterday, so it brings it to mind. But it's this sense that this huge, wide open landscape. This is, if you look at a map, that map that I have in the, Russia occupies the largest flat landscape on Earth, and it had the longest boundary on Earth, on the other side of which are very dangerous, very powerful, shall we say, neighbors. And so you have this huge, I mean, geographers have called the Soviet Union, Russia, the least defensible country on Earth. And I think that shapes what people expect out of their government. These clan formations ultimately are military based, you know, derive out of military formations that are designed to protect, you know, you have to have the sort of military chain of command, even because there was so much, there was slave raiding into Russia for centuries, until the Crimea was finally occupied. And I think people aren't aware, what is it like to have the Tatar slave raiders riding in every year, every summer, they're coming in to pick up, 10,000 Russians to sell in the slave markets. Well, you develop a very defensive posture. And I think that's still true in the Russian character. It's very warm, extremely warm inside, but it also has outside this highly protective kind of thing going on.
Right, thank you. Yvette Kaplan asks, hi Anne, your art and knowledge is incredible. The detail, especially in the surf masses, is mind-boggling. Can you tell us how long an average painting took you to complete?
Well, that huge polyptych took me 4 years. Right. So it's both because they're huge and they're extremely detailed. They take forever. And when I always think, okay, this one I'm going to get it done quickly, and it never happens. So right. I don't know. That's what I like doing.
Nice. Yeah. I have here another question by Susan Arterian. If you were to depict the power structure of a socialist society in its purest form, you spoke about that at the start, the hopes and expectations at the start of the revolution. What would the understructure look like in that case?
Whoa, that's a big question that I've never thought about. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I personally would like a society in which everybody is respected, has dignity, has an equal say in things. And obviously we don't have that now. We have a very divided society with a, top 0.1% and a lot of people suffering at the bottom. As we go through COVID, a lot of essential workers who are paid the least are the ones who have to keep going to work and suffer the most. So,
right. Yeah. I have here another very nice question by Alexandra Vacrou. How can teachers use your paintings as they teach the Russian Revolution, which is part of the official Massachusetts curriculum? Have you seen some particularly clever ways your art is used to engage students?
Well, actually, I haven't begun. I'm sort of working on a project at this point that would use my art to engage students. I haven't done it yet. I have written a book about my art, which is available online, and it's 110 pages long. I mean, it's a big, serious book about my art, and I think that some of what's in there is usable for this. And I think you could. My husband keeps saying you could teach a whole course, by following through these paintings. I mean, I think there are a million ways that this stuff could be used, and I would love to be involved with that.
Right. Francine Crawford wants to know whether your work will be exhibited in Russia.
I don't think so. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it would necessarily be safe there. Too much art gets chemicals get thrown on it, the acid gets thrown on. But I have developed ties with people in Russia, and I would love to have it displayed there if it was safe.
Right. No, I can imagine. Yeah. Kent Russell asks, do you have any insights as to the proclivity of the Russian political system to continually turn to authoritarianism?
Sorry, say it again. Insights into the proclivity
of
the
Russian political system to continually turn to authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what my art is about. And I think that it does have to do with this polyptych that I was actually probably most of what I talked about today does not deal directly with that question, but the underlying issue of my art is that it's of the difficulty of surviving with a small population on this huge flat landscape that doesn't offer you much natural protection, and that people therefore have to form a sort of human protective barrier against invaders. And I think that's where these are coming from, and that this has been such a centuries-long problem. World War II was obviously the most catastrophic example of that, where if the Soviet Union had not had an autocratic state, they would not have survived the World War II. I mean, the autocratic state did this phenomenal job of picking up its industrial production, its plants and factories, and moving them all thousands of miles eastward to be safe during World War II. And you could not have organized that without this very sort of prepared autocratic structure. So this is where I feel geography really has an impact on us and on how our societies are shaped. And I think that the United States happened to get a very geography conducive to, we're a very safe country. We have huge oceans on either side of us. We have weaker neighbors north and south, and fabulous in various different ways. Our geographic, what we've got for our geography is extremely rich in resources. And the Russians are stuck dealing with a much more difficult situation. So, yeah.
Right. So it's 1 o'clock already, and I'm very sorry that we can't cover all the questions that are still out. I want to finish, if that is still okay, with one last one that actually relates to an aspect we didn't really talk about so far. Question from Donna West. Could you elaborate on the medium that you used, for instance, paint, foundation, etc.? Was your selection informed by the media used for icons? And were there any icons or Russian folk arts in particular that you looked to for inspiration?
I paint on canvas. I actually, yeah, the collectivization and serfdom paintings were done on paper. that's a long story. But anyway, I paint on canvas. I much prefer painting on canvas with acrylic paints. Because I use these tiny brushes, I want the paint to dry fast so that I can keep going over it to get the effect that I want. I also use digital images, either of my own paintings or sometimes I buy images that I want to, the historical images, I mean, that I want to collage into my paintings. So
Right.
that answers
Okay.
the questions.
And I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and your
Thank
very
you.
insightful responses to all the questions. And with that, I give it back to Amy Gonsalvi.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Yus, for leading that really great interview and discussion. And thank you for all your hard work. I know there was a lot that went into creating this exhibition, and it's great that we're doing so many different programs. And I do just want to quickly mention that we have one more program coming up with Anne and also Elizabeth Wood. And that is on next Saturday, November 21st. It'll be sort of a two-part panel discussion where we really talk about visualizing Russian history through art. So if you're interested in that, please head over to our website, museumofrussianicons.org, and you can learn more about that program. So thank you both again, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.